Hi, welcome to a new episode of my Deuze vlog. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I'm conducting a series of interviews, conversations with media professionals and scholars who are active in the field of mental health, happiness, and well-being in creative careers. All of this to support the publication of my book on the topic, as well as to showcase and highlight the incredible work that all these people are doing. And today, I'm really excited to interview two of my personal heroes, Hannah Storm and John Crowley of the Headlines Network in the UK. Hannah and John formed the Headline Network in 2021 to develop materials and protocols, brochures, as well as providing training, workshops, and speaking engagements for journalists and newsrooms, and promoting healthier workplaces and building resilience in dealing with the many stressors on the job. Hannah, the founder of Headlines, is a former director of the International News Safety Institute and the Ethical Journalism Network. She co-authored in a very early stage one of the very first studies into moral injury and journalism for the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, together with famed Professor Anthony Feinstein. Has written and published a lot on a variety of topics. Specifically in 2024, she published her book, Mental Health and Wellbeing for Journalists, A Practical Guide, with publisher Routledge, a groundbreaking book, the first of its kind for journalism and journalists, both academically researched as well as practically applicable work. John is an editor, a trainer and consultant. Has had 20 years of experience working in newsrooms, managing newsrooms in a variety of titles. I mean, the Daily Telegraph, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and the Irish Post, for example. In 2020, he published a report together with Andrew Garthwaite called Journalism in the Time of COVID, based on a survey among 130 journalists from all over the world, checking in how people are doing and documenting the extraordinary work that all these reporters and editors were doing around the world under impossible circumstances. In my conversation with John and Hannah, we talk about the difficulty of seeing and addressing mental health and well-being when you, as a journalist, are so enmeshed in the work, in the newsroom, in the culture of the profession, in being a journalist. The inability to switch off because you always have to be in the know. We're talking about the tendency for some, certainly not all, but some media organizations of well-being washing. In other words, saying that you're taking care of your people and investing in well-being while actually not really doing all that much. Much of our conversation is about, how should I say it, that even if it's just one colleague or one manager or one leader or one editor really struggling and not addressing it, this, like a moldy satsuma in a bowl of fruit, infects everything and everyone at work in the industry, and how significant and important it is to tackle all of this together and not single out one or two people who might struggle as somehow weak or problematic. No, this is something that really touches upon everything that journalists do. And finally, we signal that the momentum of the mental health discussion in journalism, while pretty strong post-pandemic, seems to be fading somewhat. Now that the conversation is being hijacked by AI. And I can add to that observation that it's certainly interesting that it's so much easier to talk about the threats and the challenges and opportunities that we're facing because of a machine, artificial intelligence, than because of ourselves. So welcome,
Great.
and really lovely to see both of you. Um, I mean, I've got so many things I would love to discuss, but I would love to start maybe where the two of you started together, at least from what I know and what I've seen and how I followed your work, with getting support from the Google News Initiative to start a headlines network at the tail end of the pandemic. And can you talk a little bit about how that came together? Like how, because you were already separately doing work in this area. I mean, documenting well-being of journalists. I mean, having, of course, your own personal experiences in this space. And then what led to the headlines network and the response you were getting, especially at the time when this was still very new and very fresh as a discussion point in journalism from peers.
You want to go ahead, John? Take Mark through the birth of headlines.
Hannah and I met the Perugia International Journalism Festival, where a lot of fruitful partnerships and initiatives have been born. And
Right.
Hannah was speaking at an event, and I went to it. And I think we would actually, maybe we weren't kind of aware of what we were doing, but we spoke there, and then we ended up kind of going on the same panels, talking about the subject. And we would say the industry needs to do something, needs to resolve, to change, to build structures for people to support their well-being, and then nothing would get done. So what we resolved to do was actually to come together, and I think it'd be fair enough to say we were kind of working in this space, but nothing, I think, from both of us was kind of formalized. It was, Hannah had a group of people with the headlines network that she was speaking to, and I was doing surveys and so forth. But we had formed a company. We hadn't been doing workshops, and that's what the Google D&I money enabled us to do, to actually get bootstrapped, to take out, be able to take out insurance, build products, work with people, develop workshops. And yeah, it was a shot in the arm, and we wouldn't have done it without that funding. We should say, just in the interest of being transparent, that funding has ended now, and we
Mhm.
currently don't have any funding. So if there's anyone out there who's familiar with our work and would like to support it, come and get us. But
Absolutely.
and maybe, I think you mentioned there, Mark, about the post-pandemic. I think there was a realization then that there was a collective trauma among all people, not just in this industry, about what was going on, and that people needed help. And I think there was a particular interest there from funders out there that work needed to be done. I think that may have withered on the vine a little bit. That's my personal view. I don't know if Hannah agrees with me, but it was a really fruitful moment for Hannah and I to come together. It was kind of a meeting of the stars. We were just speaking before this, our work has either gone in front of, or we've worked on workshops with thousands of people. And, pretty much I can't think of one person who says this hasn't been useful. Why are you doing this?
Right.
So there is a need out there. There is still an existing need, even perhaps more pronounced now with everything that's going on, whether it's covering really tough stuff, the economic climate, all manner of different things. And that was actually, we formed it 4 years ago, Hannah, wasn't it? So
Yeah,
it's been a
yeah.
really fruitful partnership. We'd love to continue going. We'd love to continue working, and you get that little kind of warm glow in your heart from the feeling that we've helped fellow journalists, we've helped fellow people, and some of the things that they've said in public and in private to us has been really heartwarming.
I do think, just to pick up on John's point there about the necessity, it feels to me like this is more necessary now.
Mm.
This is kind of, this is not just me and John coming along with a begging bowl saying, please, sir, can we have some more? Because actually, this is really, really necessary. I'm doing separate work. We're both doing separate work, and kind of some more in this space, some less in this space. But actually, the message I'm getting from people is we have extraordinary situations that people are encountering now. So, we have existential crises around the climate crisis. We have still ongoing issues around polarization. We have, officials being elected who are still calling journalists the enemy of the people. We have, an entire kind of world in which journalists are no longer seen as the fourth estate. We have got issues in terms of job security and job insecurity, rather. We've got all of these different things that people are dealing with. And then we've got kind of crises going on, like the kind of current, we're speaking now, at a time when Iran and Israel are, a lot of us are sitting back thinking, oh my goodness, what's gonna happen? Gaza, Ukraine, all of this is going on. People are being exposed to awful stuff day in, day out.
Mm.
And unfortunately, masses and masses of funding has been cut for DEI initiatives under which mental health falls. And therefore we are seeing people around the world kind of, I don't like the image of head and hands because I don't think that's a helpful one from a mental health perspective, but just kind of thinking, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to us? And I feel like there's still a crisis kind of about it. We're sleepwalking into
Mm.
a mental health crisis. And John, we've been saying this for 4 or 5 years, right? But I actually think that, we've come through COVID and it hasn't stopped. Nothing stopped. Everybody's exhausted, even more exhausted, I think, and even less certainty now than perhaps there's ever been, and even more need for decent, robust journalism and journalists who are, well, so they can do well, as we say.
How did but you got the network started, and we do have to circle back to Perugia because that is such a significant moment for journalism, international journalism and journalists. But I mean, so you started this work, I mean, based on this genuine observation, like we've come through this crisis, this is the time to tackle this. Talking to journalists, reporters, editors, I mean, both at a managerial level and sort of, the grunt workers, if you will, I say that with respect. Um, and as you note, I mean, the numbers that we know of people indicating, of journalists indicating, like we're struggling at work, our health, our well-being feels challenged every single day, have not come down. In fact, they've gone up since. And in doing this work, has any of this changed your way of thinking what journalism is or should be, or what being a journalist is or should be? I mean, is journalism still the same thing and we just have to figure out this well-being part, or is there something more, I guess, more fundamental going on in your experience of doing this work these last years?
It certainly heightened my awareness of why journalism is important and why we need it. I don't know if you're aware, Mark, we had this podcast that we
Yes.
ran, Anna and I ran, behind the headlines, where actually we would ask people at the end of each podcast, why does journalism still matter? We'd ask them to recount one story that stayed with them, and people would open up about kind of tough experiences that has happened to them, but they would also say this is why journalism matters, and a lot of it would be what you might expect. We're bearing witness. We need to hold people, power, and institutions to account. So despite it being tough, I think a lot of people still stick with it because you do feel that you are, without sounding too grandiloquent about ourselves, you're serving a public good. Yeah, you're shining a light on things that and people that don't want light shone upon them. And there's a huge amount of pressure that comes on journalists because of that. And we heard so many different stories, from inspiring and uninspiring and depressing, from people who we did workshops with. But the big thing that we got from a lot of people was that we still care. We still want to do it, even if we're low, slow, and no pay freelancers, even though we're working in perhaps toxic environments. There were people certainly who had decided to leave journalism, but it wasn't because I don't think they believed in the project. Now, we've just had the Reuters Institute report that's just come out. For the last few years, what they've actually done is kind of flag up this news avoidance that is happening, a very worrying trend. There was something this year, they actually measured the push alerts that news organizations are putting out, and people decided to switch it off. The ordinary punter, if you want to call it like that, they can do that. They can choose to avoid the news. But as Hannah was saying, if you're enmeshed in that, you can't avoid the news because you're covering it. So in that case, we've likened it to being a first responder sometimes when you're covering really intense news. And we're going to talk maybe in a second about what work we've done. There was this report that I did during the pandemic about one journalist who said to me, it was on a national newspaper at the time, I'm stuck in a pandemic bubble. Other people could just say, look, this is too depressing, I'm not going to tune in. But he said, I couldn't tune in. I was doing this 12 hours a day. And because you're a journalist, people then go to you and go, what's going on? Because you're a journalist, you have to be in the know. Right. So I think that there is an issue where, and it particularly pertains to journalism. You look at the wider sector. I think here in the UK, there's something like 6 to 7 million people on antidepressant drugs out of 70 million, an astonishing figure. So, this is something that just doesn't affect journalism, it affects society. But in journalism in particular, there is that problem where it's very hard if you're covering breaking news to get away from it, to switch off, because you want to be in the know, because you have to cover it. And this is what Hannah and I were doing. We would teach people tools, methods, techniques, little takeaways for you able to do that, but also have borders and boundaries where you can get away from it all and come back a better person because of it.
I'm just going to jump in because I think that, just back to your question, Mark, and I would completely echo everything that John has just said. A couple of the things that I've become really aware of in the last, particularly I think probably the last 6, 7 months, but really in the last 4, 5 years as well, is we're hearing a lot about AI, right?
Right.
Huge amounts about AI. I think most of the funding that potentially was given to mental health has now gone to AI, and that's okay. AI has its place. I'm not an AI expert. I think it's really important. I think it's, fundamentally there are some great ways it can support journalism. But it's not a human being. It's not about human beings. And I think journalism is about human beings. And one of the most powerful things that we've learned in talking to all of these colleagues around the world is, and we say this a lot, is journalists are journalism's most precious resource. We are the human resources that bring about journalism. So a couple of other things I just wanted to say is we know the power as journalists of storytelling. Be a great storyteller. Ultimately, generally, that means you're going to be a great journalist. Okay. So in mental health terms, one of the things that I found has been incredibly insightful and incredibly important in the last kind of year or so is that power of storytelling when we're talking about mental health and wellbeing. Both John and I kind of have got to a space where, we share our stories relatively openly, our own personal stories. And I'm really kind of struck by the fact that when you feel safe to do that, when psychological safety is there, and that's a kind of interesting term, psychological safety, because I don't think it's a thing to me you can flick on and off. I think it's a cultural thing. But actually, when you've got this kind of psychological safety and you can story tell, people feel less isolated. And actually, I think the thing that I'd also just like to say there is we talk a lot about empathy in mental health. We talk a lot about connection in journalism. A lot of the time, empathy is the thing that connects us to people whose stories we amplify. We talk also about this idea that actually, unfortunately, we don't show ourselves empathy so much in journalism. We work with news organizations where, quite frankly, people are being told to just suck it up still, unfortunately, in 2025. You haven't got time to take a break. We're expecting this from you. Sorry, that's my doorbell. So you haven't got time to take a break. We're expecting this from you. It's bam, 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 bam. It's relentless. The capacity for breaking news is relentless. And we don't take time to take stock and kind of go, let's show ourselves a little bit of love, a little bit of compassion, because in doing so, that empathy can help us thrive, not just survive.
I wonder how you look at this also as people who are trying to help colleagues. How do we make this not just an individualized responsibility, mental health, but also sort of something that the system carries? Because that dimension I find sometimes gets lost in the different ways and people in this industry talk about it. But maybe I have a selective perception. What is your take on that?
I think I just want to kind of be clear that I think the conversation is changing. I mean, there is a lot of doom and gloom, what we've discussed, but I do think that there is some incredible work taking place. You know, a lot of organizations, not everyone. You know, I do think there's a bit of what's called well-being washing going on, a bit of lip service going on, you know, because I think people like to say that they're doing something and then, you know, they might do something, but actually they're not really doing it. And I think which then leads to that point about, I think it has to be systemic. There are roles and responsibilities that individuals take on. We often talk, John and I, about this idea about putting on our own oxygen mask first, because ultimately you're no good to anybody else if you don't look after yourself. So I think from an individual responsibility, there is that. But I think that, you know, so often that entire weight of that, then, you know, we see kind of systems and leaders and people like that kind of going, oh, well, you know, Joe hasn't done it. So, and I think so systemically, I think there has to be a cultural shift whereby these conversations are normalized and whereby, you know, it is on individuals, but it is also on leaders, the leaders of organizations to think differently and do differently and be differently. And I do think back to your point about maladaptive behaviors, folks who were perhaps started their careers, I don't know when you did, Mark, but kind of John and I both started our careers in the 1990s. You know, there's a generational thing whereby you sucked it up. That doesn't mean it was right. That does not mean it was right. Where actually any admission of struggling was an admission of failure rather than seeing that vulnerability is actually a strength. And then just one final thing I would say from a kind of in that individual institutional work needs to be done in both spaces is we're seeing a real shift now generationally. We're seeing real, you know, and I think it's wonderful that actually we're seeing kind of newer people coming into journalism with more of a expectation around, you know, people taking seriously their boundaries. John and I often kind of refer to this fantastic human being who was on one of our very, very early calls, one of our early sessions, who basically, you know, held their manager to account. They wanted to have their meeting. They insisted on having these regular meetings. It was this boundary, it's this language that fortunately a lot of younger people have. However, on the flip side, I don't believe that a lot of younger people who have perhaps started their careers during COVID, who perhaps, you know, didn't come into the office for a long time, are often given the equipment and tools to kind of help them recognize what they might be exposed to, because perhaps they've come straight into national news organizations rather than cutting their teeth more regionally or more locally. That perhaps, you know, I certainly did work experience at a local level before I then entered kind of national, international media.
Just to add on that point, yeah, that was what you were just saying about Hannah, that it was a young woman, it was a young female who actually came in and held their boss to account. So it's not quite cut and dried in the sense that young people are being kind of pushed around and keeping their heads below the parapet, as Hannah was saying, because they're used to those support networks. Maybe they've come from college and university where, dare I say, it's slightly enlightened, where there is mental health and wellbeing networks, that they're more articulate about their mental health. They feel they can speak about it and raise it a little bit more. And actually, maybe some of the people who struggle with it are the slightly longer in the tooth, dyed in the wool, maybe people of our age that maybe can't find the words to deal with it, and maybe what they do then is just leave the industry, which is really bad because they've got a lot of institutional knowledge and experience. Just the last point that I wanted to make was actually going back to that podcast, that really insightful point where you were saying that they were blaming themselves, and I've certainly not kind of thought of that. It's always interesting when people, you know, listen to the podcast and come with other things. I was just thinking about that there, and I think it goes back to the support networks, because, you know, Hannah and I had this phrase: the support networks are either fragmented, invisible, or non-existent, or traditionally have been. And maybe because those people who were speaking on those podcasts felt, you know, they didn't even realize it because those podcasts weren't there. They blame themselves. They just said, "Oh, it's me. You know, I'm a failure." And maybe if those podcasts had been, if their support networks had been there, that maybe they would have said, "Well, actually, this isn't all just on me. there's a reason why this happened. So I think there's a thing going on there when journalists beat themselves up about things, is perhaps that they've never had those support networks in the first place.
And it's not normalized, is it, John, either of these conversations? I think the toll of mental health comes instinctively with a great amount of shame, right? It's like, I feel shame because of X and Y and Z. I shouldn't, why should I, what have I got to complain about? What have I got to worry about? So there's this kind of shame blame thing going on. And actually, were we to live in an environment and work in environments that where mental health was just much more normalized, the conversations around mental health, perhaps there wouldn't be that blame and shame. I would say one thing, and I think maybe John may have something to say on this. And Anthony Feinstein, who John and I both know, he's done incredible work in this mental health space. He wrote a book on, I think it's called Journalists Under Fire, and he's done a lot of work as well. It talks in one chapter of this book about addiction. And what you were saying there reminded me of the podcast we did with Fergal Keane, the BBC correspondent, where he talks about, this idea of addiction, that nobody would kind of go and congratulate you for taking, I think, what was the phrase he used? Something like, nobody would congratulate you for going in, having a hangover or taking an overdose, but people would congratulate you for going in and out of war zones because you have this compulsion to keep going there. And I do think there's something in that whole blame, shame, addiction, identity thing that we touched on at the start that actually, perhaps needs unraveling a bit more, because there's a lot of us that we invest in these things. Journalism isn't a normal career. The very nature of news is it exists outside of normality. So the people who go in to cover this, we'd like to think we're special. We are special, of course we are. But actually, I think there's a lot that kind of gets confused within that kind of identity and relationship that we ourselves as individuals have with the work that we do.
And because those support networks aren't there, then you kind of go, you might turn to alcohol, you might turn to chemicals, you might turn to kind of risky behavior as a coping mechanism.
All those support networks were in the pub, weren't they, John? Or, we know the support networks were actually kind of exacerbating that kind of those crutches, if you like.
But informal, where you got things off your chest, it was great, you had fun. But, maybe, we talk about physical health and mental health being two sides of the same coin. And, when your physical health perhaps isn't good because you're burning the candle at both ends, that doesn't help your mental health. And what actually we used to talk about, Hannah, it's all pouring out of us now, isn't it, Hannah, on our courses, is that, you'd work at your physical health, you might go down the gym, but whenever you say, well, I'm actually working at my mental health, I might feel mentally fine one day, so okay, I can just forget about things, but actually you need to work at that too to stay mentally fit as well as physically fit. I hope that makes sense, Mark.
No, I'm just reminded what you said about the gym, and going to the gym seems like such a good idea, but then that becomes wrapped up in a new side of stressful, at least for me, because then I'm a nerd and I start keeping track of my stats, and then I have a smartwatch, and then that becomes a whole new project.
Right here. So I think the really important thing, so I'm a massive advocate for sport. Both John and I do quite a bit of sport. For me, I think it comes back to an awareness. So, I often, at Perugia this year, I was talking about my A to Z of self-care. So A for me is awareness, right? If things are slightly out of whack, misaligned, I'm going to try to exercise more because I feel like I'm trying to escape, into something. I push myself too hard. I love a smartwatch. I love a kind of Strava. I love all of that stuff. I love the accountability. I don't love it when it becomes a stick to beat myself with.
Right.
And actually, what I have to acknowledge, and I think with all of this stuff, we acknowledge that kind of where's our where are we on our kind of equilibrium? And when kind of things start shifting, what can we do to kind of perhaps put it back so it doesn't wobble too much the other way? And so I think that physical health, mental health, like John said, sometimes we push too much into one of them, and perhaps we don't give ourselves a space to kind of just stand in the garden and listen to the birds if we have a garden.
Well, and I wonder what your assessment is of. There's a wonderful friend and colleague from Melbourne, Alex Wake, and she makes this this point that there's this weird paradox in for journalists that when they get into the profession, they're expected to bring their whole selves, to be passionate about the work, to consider the work noble, as you said, Hannah, that it's special. So it's like their whole selves, this is who they are. But then once you work as a journalist, there's actually not a whole lot of room for your human beingness because, like you said, talking about struggling or possibly failing or feeling that you're failing or anything related to health and well-being is sort of in a lot of places still not okay or considered a weakness or a taboo. And it's this weird sort of like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to do this with my whole heart and soul, body and soul. But once I'm doing it, I'm not saying I have a body or soul.
Mark, you've alighted along the central contradiction of being a journalist, and it is part of your identity, very much so. And that's why it hurts so much when things go wrong. So, and I think, even when I've been let go from jobs, maybe done it, it's really, really hurt because it's bound up in your identity so much. But what Hannah and I talk about in our sessions is you're always told as a journalist, don't be the story because you've got to be objective. So
Right.
you're giving your heart and soul, you're being that person, but you also have to say, well, don't be the story, don't be the story, because then you're bringing in your own personal emotions to it. You have to stay objective, you have to report. You might be reporting from disaster zones, war zones, seeing absolute horrors, and you have to maintain that straight professional face while your stomach might be churning. As you said, you're giving your all, you're giving your whole identity to it. So it's a real dichotomy. It's a real push and a pull thing that's going on. And, you can look at it in two ways. It can create an interesting tension, an interesting dynamic, but it can also coil and tighten and really kind of get at you. And that's why it's a really specific thing being a journalist in terms of well-being and mental health pressure. You can look at other industries. It's not that we're special, as Hannah says, but there's something particular with us where you have that push and pull, which can cause a lot of tension. And I think, Mark, you've got to the heart of it there.
Do you think there are a couple of other industries that are similar? So I've been speaking quite a lot to and I think there's a danger sometimes that we look at journalism as kind of in this ivory tower. And I think that I'm not suggesting we're doing that right now, but I think the military, this idea of that you become bound up in the identity of something, you have this very, very close support network, kind of or camaraderie rather than support network, I think. And so do you think the identity thing I just find it really powerful, this whole idea of it's both protective and also elicits vulnerability, but vulnerability as in things that can cause us to experience harm rather than vulnerability as in the kind of empathy and strength thing. But I think one of the things I just wanted to say from that is even now, having been in journalism 26 years, and actually technically not having been a journalist for quite a long time, I still think of myself as, oh, hello, I'm Hannah Storm, I'm a journalist. And so actually I say to people, we talk to people about this idea, John, that with the training we do at Headlines, is find something else meaningful outside of journalism. Find something else. And there often isn't a lot of space for that. But I think it's really important that we have something else meaningful. And for me, for a lot of people, it might be their family. It might be their friends. It might be some kind of pastime or sport. It might be, in John's instance, one of your things I know is soccer, football, right? So, going to football games, playing football games. For me, it's cycling and running and writing. We both have children. So that meaningful thing. So actually, we are human beings as well. That it's not our be all and end all. One thing I was just thinking about, John, when you were talking about kind of human be the, don't be the story. It's such a fine line, isn't it? Because they want bits of you, they want the human bits of you, they want you to you've got to be objective, but also you've got to show that it is impacting you a little bit. But if you show it's impacting you too much, you become the front page spread on one of the newspapers in the UK. I'm thinking about, for instance, someone like Clive Myrie, who had that moment at the start of Kyiv, at the start of Ukraine, when he was standing in Kyiv, waiting for, to see how the kind of conflict developed. With all of the history that he had of previous conflicts, he felt overwhelmed. He felt saddened. He felt emotional, and that a lot of people picked up on that idea of how it had impacted him, not understanding the context and nuance, the kind of backgrounds and all of that stuff, and not recognizing this was a human being doing an incredible job. It was more like, oh, Clive's crying type thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But then it's like a tap, isn't it? So you want a bit of you, give us a
Yeah,
little bit of emotion, but
yeah,
not full on.
not too much.
We don't
Yeah.
want full on tears. Not for,
Yeah,
that would not be appropriate. Full on tears.
yeah.
No.
Just like, can you give us a single tear? It's like you're acting, on a for a director.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Hannah's right. I mean, our journalists self-obsessed. Yeah, big time. Yeah, totally obsessed with ourselves. And I think there's a lot that we can learn. And I think that's a really good example, Hannah, from the military, where you're bound up by that code of honor and so forth, and you can't show your emotions as well, and you have to follow a code. So yeah, there's definitely tons that we can learn from other sectors, but I do think there's something particular to journalism, and that's why I think with Headlines Network, we were the kind of one of the first set of journalists. We did your mental health, first aid training, and so forth, but we kind of got it. When we spoke to journalists, we had that authenticity because we've been under the cosh, we've been under pressure. We know what toxic newsrooms, demanding editors, not showing your emotions is about. And I think that's what resonated, I think, Hannah, wasn't it, with people? They went, oh yeah. That insight, that example,
You
I
speak
see
our
that.
language. I think it was
Yeah.
you get the fact that ultimately, if somebody says to you, turn your phone off, people are like, yeah, right, okay, yeah, right, I'm going to do that, yeah, okay.
Mm.
And whereas actually it's okay, we've found that maybe if we take some of the apps off, if we give ourselves 5 minutes away from our phone, the world is not good. The world is going to continue without our phone, right? So it's kind of like the things that we've learned and the hacks and tips and tools that we've heard, kind of it becomes this kind of great jigsaw puzzle in terms of showing the kind of broader picture. And there was a sense of authenticity. There is a sense of authenticity that we bring because we get it. We
Mm.
get it. We've been hurt by it, unfortunately, as well. Wonderful people like Dave Seglins at CBC as well in Canada. I feel sad that it takes the people who have been hurt to be the people who should stand up and go, I don't want anyone else to be hurt. But if that is the case, then, perhaps that's the way it has to work for in some instances.
I really appreciate you mentioning Dave Seglins. He's also part of the interview series that I'm doing, and in one of his reports, the Taking Care report, this study that they did among Canadian colleagues, he writes this really memorable line, and maybe I want to use that to ask you a follow-up question about all of this. He says, what is particular about working in the media and specifically journalism is that, people love their work. It's just that the work doesn't always love them back. And a lot of what we're talking about and a lot of the resources that you provide with the Headlines Network, right? I mean, you've got people can download guides. I mean, like you did all these trainings and workshops. I mean, you speak out in public, and we'll get to talking about your reports and books as well. But there's also specific resources for managers and people in leadership positions in the media. And I mean, what is your take on that particular perspective? Because on the one hand, you would say, like, now here lies a real opportunity for people in management positions to show that love, right? To acknowledge the work of people lower down in the hierarchy, and to be appreciative of, to normalize discussions about health. And on the other hand, one thing that I've really found in my research is that a lot of people, not just in journalism, but in other creative careers, who actually end up in leadership positions and who want to do better or simply do well with their colleagues and sort of, hey, now I'm, label head in the music industry, or now I'm a producer on a film set, and now I want to make sure that everything is, you know, goes well for people. They often say in research, but they feel disempowered to do that. Like that even the leaders say, like, I don't know where to begin. I don't get support to do this, either financial or training or whatever. So I'm just kind of making it up as I go along. And so how did you address that specific dimension of the work that you do? The position of leaders in the newsroom or in the news industry, and how to talk with them and help them in improving this situation.
Can I just jump in on that? I mean, I know that John's
Please.
probably got loads to say because John's kind of, led many different communities of news people, but I'm very struck by one of the conversations I had this year in Perugia with Phil Chetwin, who was global news editor, I think, I can't remember his exact title, so sorry, Phil, of Agence France Presse. Back in the COVID days, I coordinated conversations with some of the news leaders, and I remember acutely one moment they were talking about all the challenges that their journalists were facing and how they were leading and all of this stuff. And I said to this group of people, but when does somebody last ask you how you are?
Ah,
And there was this moment of kind of silence where
mm,
Phil still remembers this, and he talked about this in Perugia this year. There was this moment of silence where people were like, huh? What, me? Who? Well, no, we're just supposed to soak it up. We're just supposed to get on with it. We're not supposed to be. Nobody's supposed to ask us. But actually, the point is, um, I use the analogy of being the moldy satsuma. I think that this, as managers, unfortunately, a lot of what we live and breathe, even if we don't think it's going to trickle out, it does trickle out. So if you're a moldy satsuma in a fruit bowl, that mold is going to spread pretty quickly.
mm.
And so I think that, from a management perspective, managers are dealing with huge amounts of stuff, huge amounts of stuff. Some of them, many of them are part of what we call the sandwich generation. So they're caring for elderly parents, caring for kids too. There's so much going on. The intention is there, the belief, the desire to do this is there. But actually, when the proverbial hits the fan, they can't do it because they're just overwhelmed themselves. And I think that that's really hard for managers because you come in wanting to do something, trying to bring about change, and then, as you say, feel disempowered. But John, I'm sure you've got lots more to say in this space.
The people traditionally used to get to the top of journalism, got to the top not necessarily because they were fantastic leaders or kind of geniuses. It was just they were good at journalism,
Mm,
or they worked bloody hard or too hard. So
mm,
they had their nose to the grindstone. And Hannah and I have done workshops for leadership courses about this because, as Hannah's saying, that old cliche, it's lonely at the top. But there's no, I've never really felt there's organisations out there now who are doing that kind of leadership career progression. But most newsrooms where I've worked in, there's not been like a plan or a schedule. It's just like you broke a few stories, you were the news editor, you've got the experience, you move up the food chain. And then, as Hannah was saying, the leader, the newsroom leader, it's always that kind of quite kind of, there's a bit of bravado, generally male, soaking it all up, being the man being the kind of operative word, and doing that. So I think that sense of having that toughness, that raw hide, that, not admitting your vulnerabilities because you have people trying to take chips out of you or challenge you, becomes self-perpetuating. Yeah. And then in a sense, you were saying earlier about you give so much, but journalist doesn't give back. It's a bit like an unreliable boyfriend, where you give everything, you give your heart and your soul, and you just don't get anything back from him. He's pretty useless, pretty unreliable, doesn't call you up, doesn't say thank you, doesn't kind of acknowledge you, doesn't ask after you. So I think journalists and newsrooms need to be better boyfriends. That's my takeaway.
But I
Yeah.
remember reading in your report, John, that you did with Andrew Garthwaite
Yeah.
about journalism in the time of COVID, this survey among journalists, getting feedback from journalists all over the world. And I mean, I remember reading in the open comments of that study, a lot of journalists sort of saying, look, I'm working harder than ever before, but I'm just getting no managerial support or care.
Mm.
It just seems nobody gives a damn. And I found that really sort of, and it really aligns with what you're saying now, is right? There's that the kind of stuff that gets rewarded along the way of becoming a newsroom manager actually hinders you from showing care and showing vulnerability or empathy.
Mm.
Is that a fair
Yeah,
interpretation of
it
that
is.
data?
It is, but as Hannah is saying, there are people who are changing it, and Hannah has given those
Right.
Yeah.
examples. So we don't want to paint this really bad picture. I think people are beginning to realise it.
Yeah.
On your point about they don't give a damn, it was almost they didn't know that they
How
had
to?
to give a damn.
Right.
It's kind of almost one remove away, because it wasn't like,
Yeah.
you know, it's not like, why should I ask after them or how they're doing, you know, or anything like that. It was kind of ignorance rather than something, you know, evil. You know, I'm sure I actually I have worked with some evil news editors who really didn't give a damn, but I think
There
a
are
lot
some,
of people,
yeah.
a lot of them just didn't even realize that they needed to ask after them. Well, you're my boss, you're my leader, you're my line manager, and they're just caring about breaking the stories because that's all they've done. And
Right.
they haven't been groomed or trained, because as saying
Yeah.
that there's been no kind of leadership workflow processes there. And that's why Hannah and I hit a really good spot when we were training. Go, oh, right, actually, maybe we need this. I mean, the other big elephant in the room is money. So there's, you know, it's declining resources. So yeah, do you want to do this kind of expensive bells and whistles leadership program? Or, you know, if we do, we might have to let a few more staff go, or, you know, lose a few computers or whatever. And it's like, okay, I think we'll just, you know, we'll keep the staff, or, you know, we'll deal with that rather than actually spend money on it. And, you know, the feedback that Hannah and I used to get is, we really need this. You know, so many
Yeah.
people, they said to us, didn't they? We really need this, but just between us, we don't have the money. I don't have to spend for this.
Yeah. I do also think that it's a resource issue again. I think, I do think that it's about sometimes they feel like they don't have time to give a damn. I think that's not, or they don't have the resources to give a damn. And I think that I'm thinking about kind of one of the chapters in the book I wrote was about empathy and effective leadership. And, there are, as John has said, we both said there are some absolutely fabulous people out there doing some amazing stuff, advocating for this. And I think where we can kind of, where leaders do this well, they then breed and build cultures that are really psychologically safe, where there's trust, where there's people thrive, all of this. But I think that, if you imagine that a leader in today's environment is, dealing with the threats of job insecurity, maybe having to make people redundant, figuring out how AI is going to be incorporated into newsrooms, they've got, endless numbers of stories going on, sending people here, there, and everywhere. They're just dealing with kind of ongoing crisis, protracted kind of issues, challenges, change, transformation. I think one of the things for me is I don't think we've integrated the conversation sufficiently to actually recognize that actually well-being, it's not just a nice to have, it's a must have, because actually unless we're incorporating how are we supporting our folks to be the best versions of themselves, and in so doing, create an environment and an institution, an organization that is sustainable because the people in it are sustainable. And I think if we were to reframe the conversation, which we were trying to do, John, about proactively kind of creating those environments by kind of thinking that, well-being cuts across everything, mental health resilience cuts across everything, then I think leaders will recognize that actually it is something that needs to be part of their everyday vocabulary, rather than a kind of like, hey John, how you doing? And then John walks off and kind of goes, oh, I'm fine. And actually John is like, you haven't got a clue how shit today is, excuse my language. And actually if the manager then goes, John, do you fancy a cup of tea and we'll have a quick chat? So John goes, actually my day's become 10% better because somebody's just given me the space and time. John, I'm speaking for you. It might just be Hannah in this instance, but somebody's recognizing that this, and that took me all of what, 5 minutes?
Mm.
And you're going to get better, more out of somebody then, having given
Yeah.
them that 5 minutes, than if you hadn't.
And if you have those positive work environments, then you have people who feel less under pressure. They're taking less days off for
Yeah.
mental health, for stress. You're not losing people because they've had enough. We spend all this money and resources on young people, bringing them in, and then they just look around and just go, "This place is horrible."
Right.
They're
I'm
more
going to go into
effective.
another industry and
Yeah.
another sector. So, as Hannah was saying, it's not just an adjunct. It's not a nice to have thing. That's what we used to say, is that it's kind of, it really needs to be run like a golden thread through your leadership, and it will make journalism better. It will keep hold of people. The problem is that we've always Not that we've struggled, but the point I think that people who get it struggle to say is how can you show how much that is worth? It's hard to put a cost on it because you say, well, if you have, better newsrooms, you have better people do. Well, can you give me a measurement on that? Well, I can't. I can't. It will just be better. Well, that sounds a little bit amorphous to me, and that's where I think, if I've said this to you, I think before, Mark, about if there's a way to, you've talked about measuring happiness, but if there's a way to measure positive newsrooms, what impact it has and what benefit it has. I don't know the measure, what it is. Then you might be able to go then and go, well, there you go. Look, you can show that to people. Look what's happened at these enlightened places.
Right.
This is where you'll get better journalism. But at the moment, it's more of a vibe, isn't it? It's more of like, yeah, we'll do this better. We know. I think the three of us know it will be better, but we can't kind of show that on a spreadsheet, and maybe that's bad, but that's what people want to see now. They just want to see numbers.
One way of making sure to highlight the significance and the breadth of this issue, both highlighting positive interventions as well as just signaling the problem, is done through all the resources that you provide. And of course, Hannah, you already mentioned it. I mean, your 2024 book on mental health for journalists, I mean, it's such a groundbreaking work. First of all, just also on a personal note, thanks so much for writing it. We use it in our program. It's a tremendous resource for all of us. And beyond that, I mean, writing such a book for what is essentially an academic publisher, and getting it out there. I mean, that's an enormous. I mean, I know for personally what a significant investment that is. I mean, can you say a little bit about what led you to writing that book, and maybe something about the feedback that you've gotten since it's come out?
Yeah, well, thank you for that feedback because it's really, really nice to have validation, as we know, for kind of the passion projects and the kind of labors of love, or whatever phrase we want to use in this instance. So I was initially approached to write the book, but then had to go back through this kind of system where, you have to put in a proposal. I was told you'd probably be a good person to do this. You talk about your experiences openly, you write about stuff a lot, how do you feel? This book doesn't exist. Of course, that's lovely because somebody kind of like, makes you feel good about things, and you kind of go, yeah, I'm going to do it, and then reality hits. And as John will probably testify, because I was absent a fair bit from the Headlines Network conversations, it was really big. It was really big, and it was really ambitious, and it was really tiring. And actually, ultimately, I'm really glad I did it. But I think I bit off more than I could chew, and I didn't realize when I bit that off that quite how much of a challenge it was going to be. So I think the absolute key thing for me in that is that desire around storytelling, and the kind of the way that I realized in speaking about my own PTSD and recovery, my own kind of sexual assaults I experienced, my own kind of journey through journalism, that storytelling was at the heart of this. And so I had this incredible experience where I was able to interview about 45 people, somewhere between 42 and 45, I can't remember the exact number, people from around the world who gave me generously their time for free and talked to me about their experiences and what good practice looked like in their cultures and industries and institutions, and about their journeys. So I guess it was a kind of, I'd been in journalism for this number of years. I knew how to connect with people. I'd had my own awful experiences that had taught me a lot about myself and about kind of life in general and the industry. And then it all kind of came together, and so then being able to plan it through this idea of how have the conversations changed, who's doing what, where, how, what are the key issues, and then filling it with case studies. So I think I have about 13 case studies of people, ranging from the wonderful, Rana Ayub in India, through to Amantha Pereira, who you'll know from, his work in Sri Lanka and Australia, and then people like Anthony Feinstein in there as well. So yeah, it's been a labor of love, but the feedback has been wonderful. It's just over a year since it came out. I still haven't managed my launch party, book launch party, so maybe I'll need to do that, in at some stage. Uh, I think that journalists, we give them a lot of information. John and I talked all about how do we kind of sell the resources, or how do we package the resources rather. I think that actually sometimes I don't know that many journalists are going to sit there and read the 160, 70, 80 pages of the book, but I think that people can flick through it. And also I know that teachers, practitioners, academic researchers, and other people interested in journalism, I'm hoping it's that kind of thing that chimes with them as well.
Um, well, I mean, it's a tremendous I mean, and the fact that it's there, I mean, might also, I would assume it lends also. I mean, like you said, it's credible on multiple levels, right? It's credible because it's your personal story and your history that you're open about. It's credible because, like you both of you said earlier, you speak the language of the newsroom, right? I mean, you have that professional history and that credibility. And then it's credible because it's based on all these case studies, on solid research, and on, of course, all the work that you've done also individually as well as through the Headlines Network. So in that sense, it's such a powerful resource, and I'm happy you're getting feedback and just between the lines.
You're never enough
Um,
feedback. So please feel free to anybody who would like to read the book, give me more feedback, buy the book, put food on my table, and also acknowledge the fact that mental health is a conversation that we all need to have. So yes, not enough feedback. Thank you, Mark. I think that it's kind of coming back to our conversation that John's part of as well. Is It's amazing, isn't it, John, this community, how this community is built up over years, and the solidarity that people bring, and the support that people offer each other. I think it's extraordinary, that community. I think that, inevitably sometimes there's a little bit of competition, and we've seen that, a little bit of kind of territorial kind of like overlording sometimes. But I think that, I think this is an issue that everybody butts up against at some stage in their life, everybody. And
mm,
therefore, the idea that you could be the sole purveyor of all of this wisdom one could be the sole purveyor of all this wisdom is ridiculous. Actually, it's the more we can bring people together in these instances for joint conversations, like John and I have done, for events like the one, there's the Mark Cabra and the Self-Investigation does their mental health summit.
right.
We've been part of that last year. Hopefully we're going to be part of John's going to be part of it this year. So yes is a simple answer, but kind of also just bringing it back to the conversation we're having today about the more we speak about this, the more we join together, hopefully the more impact we have.
I mean, you've done all this work. You've published reports. You've published your book. I mean, Headlines Network is built. I mean, now of course for the next phase of funding and then rolling it out. And we're all observing that in this field, in this space about talking about mental health, there's a lot of encouraging developments, right? More people taking responsibility, also on a leadership level. So what's next? I mean, and I've been asking this question to a lot of people in this area, also in other media industries and games and in film. And what I often get back is that everything comes back to something you've said earlier in our conversation as well, is that to normalize the conversation. I mean, beyond specific protocols and guidelines and things people can do or checklists that they can work through, is that there's still, I mean, there's real force behind that the conversation is getting more normal. So is that something you see as well? Like this is the big thing right now. It's just let's chat about well-being for a bit, and then it's okay. Nobody feels defensive or threatened or something like that. Or is there something else that needs to happen right now to give this a bit more momentum?
Uh, no, I think it's come off the boil, actually.
Mm, mm,
I think since the pandemic, I think, we've moved on to other things, and there's AI, there's lots of problems. There's problems around, well, it relates into what we're talking around about funding. I think what's happened in the US around the cutting of funding and aid for not just journalism, but for lots of different voluntary sectors that need it has really hurt the industry big time. And I think, as Hannah was saying, we need it more than ever. We need to keep that conversation going. There are enlightened people out there, and we're friends and colleagues and admirers of what they do, but we really need to keep our foot on the pedal and really keep pushing at this. And as Hannah was saying, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, for the reasons that we said, and unashamedly here, Hannah and I need money to keep this going. We really do.
Absolutely.
So there's somebody out there who's listening to this, Mark, who have been taken aback in a good way, disarmed by what we've said, and think that our project is worthy of support, then get in touch with us.